problem, and that's pretty remarkable in my mind. That's something that we could be preventing and working harder on is the third largest emitter. In the US, food waste is upwards of 40% of all the food we have here. Most of our food waste comes off of consumer plates. So it's coming out of households and at restaurants. 60% of our food waste in the US ends up in landfills. That's 66.2 million tons per year. That's responsible for almost 60% of methane emissions that are escaping from landfills. So again, methane being that particularly potent greenhouse forming gas. And then I always like to, when we're thinking about the people side of food waste, if we could save those calories and get them out of landfills before they go bad, we could feed 150 million people in the US a year. And we know that we have 30 to 40 million food insecure Americans, so this could totally change nutrition and health in the United States. And these statistics from EPA, I think, are just helpful for grasping the situation. The greenhouse gas emissions from food waste are more than 42 coal-fired power plants, what they emit in a year, and we're basically using land the size of California and New York to produce food that is then thrown into landfills. So, super frustrating. So if we narrow down to the Wisconsin context, the Department of Natural Resources in Wisconsin estimates that we have 1.2 million tons of municipal solid waste across the state that could be diverted from landfills into composting. So it's organic material that could be moved into composting. You can see here the top 5 components statewide of our municipal waste. The top is wasted food, and the third is food scraps. So together, 20.5% of our landfills in Wisconsin are food waste that could perceivably be removed and composted, not even to mention things like compostable paper, which also could be removed. If we actually manage to save and compost this food waste, just in Wisconsin, in 1 year we could reduce as much greenhouse gases as taking almost 600,000 passenger cars off the road. But obviously it's a hard thing to do, because we would be doing it if it was super easy. So I'm assuming all of you live in Madison or nearby, and you know that we do not have municipal composting in the city of Madison. We do have yard waste pickup, right? And that is taken and composted, but we don't have a good system for food waste. Currently, there are a few small companies vying for the market share, and it's very hard to get people to pay to take their waste away, because what do they get in return for that? So I will say this is a really tricky challenge, and we need more political buy-in from leaders. We need better structures. I grew up in Boulder, Colorado. My parents have in their driveway a giant trash bin that is for compost, a giant recycling bin, and the world's tiniest garbage bin. That is the city mandating that everybody compost and recycle, and that you're supposed to reduce your trash. Some people like it, some people don't like it, but they then sell the compost back to the residents at a very cheap price, and my dad has definitely tapped into that. He rents a trailer every year and fills it with compost. So cities are doing it all over the country, and I'm not really sure why Madison isn't yet. Of course, we have difficult winters here, so there are costs associated with composting year-round that maybe Boulder doesn't face quite as bad. I'm not sure. So the University of Wisconsin here, what do we have? 40,000 students, 45,000 students. It's like a little city in of itself. We have a pretty tenuous relationship with food waste on campus. In 2009, the university started collecting food scraps from main campus, and these were then taken to the Madison Agricultural Research Station and composted via a woodrow composting method, which is where you do it out on the field in the big rows, and you need to continually be turning that compost to get it oxygen so that the food breaks down. That system didn't last 10 years because of contamination problems. So it relied on students, faculty, and other employees to self-sort their food waste. And they had so much contamination from plastic wrappers, metal forks that were puncturing tractor tires. And then when you put industrial compostable dishes and things, they don't compost well in a woodrow system because it's not an industrial composting system. So the contamination became untenable, and the university stopped doing that. It was too expensive and too hard. In 2018, the university got a contract with a biodigester company to outsource a bunch of our campus food waste, which worked for a little while, but also had contamination issues. People are just really bad at sorting and taking the time to do that, and I also think we're not great at communicating with people about how to do that, especially if they're in a rush. So there are costs and communications associated with it. But ultimately, the company was sold to another owner, and they decided that it wasn't worth it for them to do campus food waste, and so they're doing just manure and agricultural waste. So we then had nowhere to send food waste at UW. But I think there's definitely an interest in dealing with our food waste. The Office of Sustainability knows this. Everybody on campus knows this. So there's been this, UW Zero Waste initiative, and a new composting trial was started in 2022. So this is taking compost from back of house, meaning just from the food processing side before food gets to consumers, because there you can really control it, and you can train employees and kitchen staff to sort it better. And so right now we are taking food waste from 4 sources: Gordon Dining Center, Dijon, Union South, and Memorial Union. And so that's back of house food waste, and then food waste from events. Did you know you've been to the UW catered events, and there's always a lot of food left over? So that is all now being composted. And those 4 locations are actually responsible for 50% of the food waste on campus, so that's a good starting point. But clearly, I think we have a long way to go at UW to actually meet this zero waste target and actually tackle food waste on campus. I do want to give a little shout out to my undergrad student, Olive. She and I worked on this campaign to improve messaging around food waste on campus. Housing and Dining has done some work on this in the past, but when we did a survey of campus, there wasn't consistent messaging. And so she developed these posters. She's not a design student, she's a global health student. I think she did a pretty good job. And we got these posters put up at several dining halls across campus, and then did like a survey and saw what students thought. And I think they have a minimal effect, but it's kind of the lowest hanging fruit effect. It's like, oh, if people are slightly more aware, we can reduce food waste by maybe 10 to 20% in the dining hall. That's worth it to me, just to do the communication side. Unfortunately, we had limited options for what we could tell people to do, because these are all you care to eat facilities, so you cannot have students bringing in Tupperwares to take their leftover food home, because then you would just have people taking extra meals and the university would lose a lot of money. So it was kind of an interesting challenge of like, what can you do with limited options? And obviously we don't have composting on the front of house, so you also can't tell them to put it in the compost bin. So it was a very interesting side note. So anyway, there is other work happening on campus, which is the point here. So now I'm going to take you to Uganda with me, where I was in November of last year. This is a picture of the Chaka-2 refugee settlement, which is in kind of the southwest of the country. The Chaka-2 refugee settlement is home to more than 110,000 refugees. Uganda is actually very friendly to refugees. I believe they have more refugees than any African nation. These refugees are coming from Congo, Rwanda, Burundi, fleeing violence, and so you have a mix of cultures, languages, and people in these refugee camps. And so it's very different than Madison, Wisconsin. But I bring this up because I was there working on a very similar project. Food waste is a problem even in this context. I just want to point out that these refugee settlements are very densely populated. People have little amounts of land, but not a huge amount of land to engage in agricultural activities. And there's a big food crisis right now in this part of the world, and refugees face high levels of food insecurity and malnutrition, despite lots of efforts by the government of Uganda and outside aid agencies to improve health and nutrition. So people are looking for opportunities for new jobs to make money, and also access to more food. Surprisingly, 40% of fruits and vegetables in Uganda are lost or discarded. This is surprising, right? Uganda is right near the equator. It's a tropical country. They can produce a lot of these things year-round. The problem is there is not good infrastructure for preserving food, right? For refrigeration, for drying, for packaging, moving, processing. So you literally have an influx of mangoes that then start rotting on the ground because there's not a good way to deal with that. And there isn't good structures, just like Madison, for municipal picking up of food waste. So all of this to say is that these problems are not unique to either place. They're really big challenges with different infrastructure needs. So I would argue that in both Uganda and Wisconsin, we need innovative agricultural and food waste solutions to protect human and planetary health into the future. So one such solution might be investing in insect agriculture, or the use of insects as food and feed, which has really been underexplored up till the last 20 years, I would say. So I first got interested in this in 2013 when the UN FAO put out this really interesting report on ramping up use of insects for human food and also for animal feed to improve the global nutrition situation. I read this report cover to cover, and at the end had 1 million questions, and that became a dissertation. So that's a good sign. There's lots of interesting stuff here. And I think something that really speaks to me today is I'm actually a vegetarian, or an endotarian. I eat insects, but I don't eat other meats. But I think we're not going to get people to all stop eating meat, and I'm not even saying that's a good idea. But I think if everyone thought a little bit more about what their meat eats, we could also make an impact on reducing emissions and the impact of agriculture. So insect agriculture, or mini livestock, I think is a really great idea. Humans have been eating insects throughout history and across the globe, but mostly they're being foraged or collected from the wild. We've actually been farming insects for thousands of years, but mostly honeybees and silkworms. So it's just now that humans are exploring farming lots of other species of insects. I think farming insects increases our opportunity to actually have a consistent supply of insects as feed or food and to ensure safety. And we can generate a sustainable protein and nutrition source with lower environmental resources, which I'll talk about. And then really importantly, insects are already a natural component of the diet of things that we eat, like fish, particularly carnivorous fish, birds, poultry, pigs, and also people, of course. It's kind of interesting that we've moved away from letting chickens, for example, eat insects. It's a totally natural part of their diet, but when you keep them inside all the time and you're feeding them a processed meal, they're not getting that natural part of the diet. So there are many, many benefits to farming insects for both human food and animal feed. First of all, they need significantly less feed than other animal sources because they have a higher feed conversion efficiency. This is due in part to the fact that insects are cold-blooded, right? They're ectotherms, so they don't waste energy regulating their body temperature the way you and I do. So insects need exponentially less feed per kilogram of weight gain compared to beef, for example. We should also consider the type of feed required. So a lot of insects are quite adept recyclers. They can take something that's unusable for us or basically a waste stream and convert it into something that's super valuable and nutritious, like food waste, cow manure, and there's new research showing that some insects can break down plastics like polystyrene, likely due to unique microbial communities in their guts, but super interesting. Like, what if we could deal with the plastic in the ocean using an insect strategy? That could be really interesting. So I think this like recycling capability is super important. And also just pointing out that without bacteria and insects, we'd all be walking around in filth, everywhere all the time. They're helping clean up the earth, right? I'm just gonna skip that for the moment. Insects are also very water thrifty. Many species don't need to drink water. They're actually just pulling water out of their feed source. So in one study, you compared 1 gram of protein from insects versus 1 gram of protein from pork, chicken, and beef, and the insects need a lot less. This was just a study of one species, so if we looked at other insects, we may see even better results. Because insects need less feed, they also require less land overall, because you don't have to grow fields and fields of soy to feed them. And also, insects can be farmed in, I added this because we're talking about feed today. So if you compare land use for feed production, so a main source of feed for livestock is soy, right? And so if you compare producing, kilograms of feed from black soldier flies versus soy, you can do exponentially more, like hundreds times more protein from a black soldier fly farm than soy on the same amount of land, because they can be farmed vertically in systems like this. So I've been farming insects under my kitchen sink for a long time because you don't have to have a yard to be an insect farmer. And you can farm insects in very low-tech ways with very limited requirements. Does that mean you're going to have optimal production of your insects? No, but like I was farming insects very easily for consumption and to give to my friends who had chickens, you know, and it was just basically in-house composting using insects, and then I had this high-quality product at the end. I like this also because it makes it more accessible to many people. Think refugees in Uganda, for example. Insects, in addition to their highly efficient use of resources, are also less responsible for the emission of greenhouse gases compared to other animal-sourced proteins. So these comparisons are most useful when you think about insects as food, but I just wanted to point that out to you. Insects are also super nutrient dense. They're quite comparable to meat and other animal products in that they're really high in energy, protein, and fat, and low in carbohydrates. We can say that many species have 55 to 75% protein by dry weight, and that protein is considered to be very bioavailable, very digestible. For humans, most characteristically have all essential amino acids for human nutrition. Of course, fish and poultry and other animals have different essential amino acids, so you have to balance that when you mix them into their diet. Some insects, like farmed crickets, for example, have more iron than beef. Some are high in B vitamins like niacin or B3. We can also find antioxidants and bioactive peptides in insects with potential health-promoting properties. And then my favorite part about insects is that they have this very unique fiber source that is chitin or chitosan, which makes up the exoskeleton. So there's some evidence, and my work, I've done some clinical trials with people looking at the impact of chitin on gut microbiome. And there's some evidence in animal trials as well that this fiber can be manipulated through digestion to become a prebiotic. And by prebiotic, I mean a fiber source that promotes the growth of a probiotic. So it's food for probiotics in the gut, which leads to beneficial health outcomes. Oh, and if you're thinking about insects as human food, depending on what they've been fed on, they can be gluten, soy, nut, and dairy-free. So there's an interest from like an allergen perspective to look at insects. So this is all to say that there are many uses for farmed insects that I think make them very exciting. We can feed them to animals, including our pets. We can use them to reduce waste, like manure and food waste. We can use what they generate as waste, their frass or their manure, as a fertilizer. We can process them into different products and sell them into future markets, or we could eat them directly. So with that, I would like to introduce you to the superfly, the black soldier fly, which is my favorite feed insect at the moment because we know a lot about it. So if you happen to put into ChatGPT, please generate an image of a superhero black soldier fly, you might get an image like this, which I'm sharing with you. Because they have this Superman-like ability to transform waste and other unusable products into a high-quality protein source. As larvae, they have a voracious appetite. They eat a lot, and they can eat almost anything, and I'm telling you almost anything. They can eat cow manure, they can eat food waste, they can eat grain, they can eat abattoir or slaughterhouse waste. They can break down almost anything. Flexible. They also reproduce really quickly and have a pretty short lifespan. And they can literally be farmed in a bucket. So I was briefly farming them in my backyard just with a plastic container, like a bin, very basic. If they are fed on a very wet feed substrate, when they're about ready to pupate, which is right when they're most nutritious, by the way, they will crawl out of that wet feed substrate looking for somewhere to be safe and pupate to become flies. So you can put a little ramp in your bucket, and they will crawl out and just harvest themselves. You can put a little container on the outside and feed them straight to your backyard chickens, or do whatever you want with them, which is cool, but it really depends on the feed that you give them. So a little more about the black soldier fly. They're big flies. Sometimes people mistake them for wasps, but they don't sting, they don't bite. This is the larva, that's the fly. They are not known to be a disease vector or a pest for humans. Well, this is partly because they don't eat as adults. As adults, all they're doing is mating and laying eggs. So unlike houseflies, which are going to be very excited about your crumbs in your kitchen and come bother you, black soldier flies are just looking for something smelly that's rotting to lay their eggs in or nearby. So they really aren't a pest in the way that other flies are pests. They're already part of the diet of many animals. They tend to reduce risks associated with rotting materials. There's evidence that if you have an E. coli in a chicken manure and you feed it to black soldier flies, you can actually remediate and get rid of that E. coli. So there's really interesting potential properties for dealing with waste that's contaminated in some way. And they often will outcompete other flies and insects. So that's a nice thing too, because they're not pests. And if you have your bucket in your yard, they're going to if you put a bunch of black soldier fly larvae in there, they're going to outcompete house flies and other flies for that feed, which is nice. I also just want to say that they are found all across the world, but is thought to have been originated in North America. They do best in kind of warm tropical climates. So here in Wisconsin, a fear is how do we keep them happy in the winter? And it's very, very cold, but you will find them in Florida with abundance all the time. So I think that black soldier flies can fit really nicely into this idea of a circular economy. They can break down waste streams and transform them into other products that can then be used and moved through the food system and kind of keep everything circular and within. Does anybody remember Growing Power in Milwaukee? Yeah. Growing Power had an hydroponics aquaponics system, and they for a while were rearing black soldier flies to partially feed their fish, and it was kind of this very cool two systems working right next to each other. I don't remember really what happened to Growing Power, but I remember that it was working for them. I think something else is why they shut down, but kind of a cool system. So black soldier flies are really gaining attention, in part because they can be farmed really industrially. This doesn't even look like a farm really, it looks like a factory. Or they can be farmed really in really basic kind of rudimentary conditions. And we're seeing that. We're seeing really large scale farming operations and then really small scale emerging at the same time. So I think they can help us reduce landfill waste and reduce those methane emissions from food waste, the leaching of pollutants and other pollution. I think we can generate a really interesting organic fertilizer from black soldier flies, which is kind of a slow release fertilizer. And I think applying that to our field will promote soil health in the long run. And then we can produce this high quality feed ingredient and hopefully reduce cost. So I have this vision of farmers kind of adding black soldier flies onto a dairy farm as a side operation that's not that much effort, hopefully, that could just be a side income and help them deal with the excess of dairy manure, which is a huge challenge for Wisconsin farmers. And I already mentioned they contain interesting properties like these proteins and antimicrobial peptides and fibers that with more research we'll know better exactly how they influence animal health. But we already have a bunch of feed trials and evidence that they, for laying hens, can improve growth performance of the birds, their resistance to pathogens, the quality of the eggs, and then we have a little bit of data on improved gut health in fish and in chickens, and there's new research looking at pigs and cattle, actually, which I think is really interesting as well. So why would we maybe want to do this at UW? Well, black soldier fly farming, or using black soldier fly larvae, is basically super fast composting, right? Basically what we're doing is we're composting the food waste the same way we could be out on the field, but we're doing it way faster, and we're actually generating fewer greenhouse gases in that process, significantly fewer. And then at the end, we don't just have compost for the garden, we have this high quality feed ingredient, and we have a compost for the garden, essentially. So to me, it's just kind of like a win-win, and I don't necessarily foresee this being all we're doing with food waste. I think we could set up a system where some of our food waste is diverted here, some of it's diverted here, and then we work really hard to reduce food waste in the first place also. So I will say that the US is really far behind when it comes to research and investment in insects as feed and also as food. Almost all of it is happening in Europe and Asia, but we do have two big companies now with investments in the US. So EnviroFlight is an American company that is producing black soldier fly and frass for commercial sale. And InnovaFeed is a French company that has just opened an insect plant in Illinois. And I actually met one of the women that moved here from France to open this plant, and they're going to be using agricultural byproducts from corn production, which is super interesting for their larva production, with the goal of generating feed. I think they're really interested in the pet feed industry because the price point is higher. You know, people will pay a premium for specialty pet food. But I hope they look into other areas too. EnviroFlight, I think, is looking mostly at poultry feed. So the biggest markets for black soldier fly larvae right now are fish feed, poultry feed, and pet food. So if you want to compete, what's the main ingredient in aquaculture feed? It's fish meal, right? And fish oil, which is a finite resource that's actually quite energy intensive because you either are getting fish out of the ocean and grinding them up to make fish meal, or you're getting like scraps from fish processing and grinding it up to make fish meal. So that's what black soldier flies have to compete with on a cost level to make a difference in the industry. But I think black soldier flies are significantly more sustainable than fish meal and fish oil. But if we want to think about black soldier flies on a nutrient level, we have to compare them to what they'll be used in substitution for. So we'd be substituting fish meal for black soldier fly meal. So the nutrient composition of black soldier flies really changes depending on what you feed them. So one study found that the crude protein of the black soldier fly meal was 85%, whereas fish meal was 64, based on what they were feeding them. Another study had the black soldier fly meal at almost 60%, so that was a little lower than fish meal, but the protein of soybean was only 49. And so soybean is another thing that black soldier fly will compete with as a protein in feed, formulated feeds. So you have to balance. Like if you want to use a waste stream to feed your black soldier flies, you may lose a little bit of the protein or the nutritional quality of the black soldier fly at the end of the day. And with fish meal, of course, it's really high quality because it's actually fish being ground up. Sorry, that's a little hard to read. I thought you might be interested just to hear a little bit about US regulations right now. So currently, for human food, there are almost no regulations on insects except for that they have to be produced intentionally for human food. But for feed, we are pretty strict here in the US with AFCO regulating the use. So right now, black soldier fly larvae are approved for use in feed for salmonoids, so salmon, trout, and char, and also poultry, and they must meet very strict safety standards. And they were provisionally approved for inclusion in adult dog food recently, but you'll see on the market there's a lot of pet treats with edible insects because the treats don't have to meet the same standards as a complete diet. So I met the founder of this company, Jiminy's. She was awesome. So they're trying to reduce the environmental impact of dog food by putting in crickets and black soldier flies. And dogs love it. They do not discriminate. I have seen this in person. My sister has a dog, and I bought him some, and it was like he was just happy as he always is, you know? Pet treats. But here's the tricky part. Currently, black soldier flies for animal feed are only approved if they're fed pre-consumer waste. So you cannot feed your black soldier flies food waste and then put them into livestock and put them into fish feed or chicken feed. That's confusing to me because I think if you could meet the same safety standards, I don't understand why they wouldn't approve that. But my guess is they're very conservative. So they need more data to show that it is safe, even if the insects are fed post-consumer waste, and then they will approve it slowly after that. So obviously we need more safety tests, research, and industry involvement to move that process forward. So I've painted a very pretty picture for you of why insects are amazing as a feed and a food. But there's so much we don't know and a lot that could go wrong. We know that they're great recyclers, but the industry is it's just a baby industry. Like, we've been domesticating and farming other crops and animals for thousands of years, and with black soldier flies it's been less than 20. So let's give ourselves a little time to make sure that we are doing everything right. I think there are big questions about the sentience of insects. You know, how should we be treating insects to be ethical? How can we optimize production and profits without falling into the traps of what I would call kind of conventional industrial agriculture, which is often profit motivated over environmental sustainability? How can we mitigate any risks? One thing that really concerns me is that insect farming is a monoculture, essentially. We're farming one species of insect in mass. So you're putting yourself at risk of, like, a couple of years ago, a cricket virus went through the US and all the cricket farmers lost all their Acheta domesticus crickets because that's all they had, and they just created these perfect little niches for that. So how do we mitigate risks like that? How do we mitigate risks getting into the environment? This monoculture question. But something that really excites me is that we know there are more than 2,100 edible insects, and these are just insects that people have been eating, so there's probably a lot more that would be totally suitable for animals. And we haven't scratched the surface of farming all of them and their unique properties. So there are many, many knowns and many more unknowns, so this really large research gap that we're going to try and fill here, at least in part, at UW-Madison. So we have a new black soldier fly working group here on campus. It's a cross-campus collaboration. We have engagement from engineering, dairy and animal sciences, Nelson, my department, which is also community environmental sociology, vet med, Office of Sustainability, agronomy. It's a really big, entomology, really big cross-campus collaboration. So our goal is to establish a small on-campus black soldier fly colony for applied research and community engagement, one that could potentially be scaled up in the future, or we can use to model what a future scale-up would look like. We want to know how much on-campus food waste can we feasibly divert to black soldier fly rearing? What are the benefits and risks of doing that? Would it actually lead to greenhouse gas reductions for the university? What are the labor requirements and the cost? I had someone ask me, well, why on campus would this work better than traditional composting, right? Because we had all these problems with traditional composting when we had the same problems. I think we would struggle with the sorting of food waste because black soldier flies can eat a lot, but they're not going to be able to eat a metal fork, right? But I think there's a couple exciting things about black soldier flies. We can farm them vertically in a smaller space on campus, and we can reduce the transport needed to move compost off campus. We could engage students, and I think what a better way to teach people to compost than to be like, this is food for an insect. So obviously you're not going to give this insect a metal fork, right? So maybe there's some behavior change communication we could do around insects. And also, again, we have this added value end product, which is the black soldier fly larva itself, which we can then use in poultry research. We could then process and sell it. There's a ton of things we could do. So we want to know, in the Wisconsin context, can black soldier flies serve as that alternative feed ingredient to partially replace current animal feeds with an actual environmental impact? And could Wisconsin farmers produce this insect on their farms in tandem with what they're doing, or as new farmers could emerge just to farm black soldier flies in Wisconsin? Yeah, and economic development in rural communities is something that we're really invested in as well. So we got a new grant in 2024, which is exciting. So the title of the grant is Advancing Sustainable Agriculture Through Insect Farming. The PI is Dr. Sarah Adcock. She's right here. She's in Department of Animal and Dairy Sciences, so I'm co-leading the project with her. The grant is from USDA SARE, the Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education Department, and we have kind of a stakeholder advisory group, which includes egg production companies. Organic Valley is really interested, but one challenge we're having is you can't really say manure is organic, which is if it doesn't come from organically fed cows. So it's an interesting, we're working with some folks here at CIS to think about that. EnviroFlight, which is that insect producer here in the US, and then the USDA and the grass-fed organics, or grass-fed organics as well. So the aims of our project are kind of what I just said, to establish this prototype farm on campus, to evaluate all of the questions that I've been bringing up about nutritional quality, sustainability, and economic viability, but really with an eye on the Wisconsin context, like locally sourced agricultural waste streams, locally sourced food waste from the UW, and see if this is actually viable. And then we want to do outreach with farmers, because this is a SARE grant and they always emphasize outreach. So trying to understand farmers' interest in either feeding their chickens black soldier fly based feeds, or actually engaging in insect farming. So what would be the barriers and benefits to doing that? Yes, barriers and conduits to adoption. So here's just a graphic of kind of what we're going to do on campus. We're going to collect campus food waste and other waste streams and develop kind of prototype insect farm on campus, and then potentially process those insects into their component parts for research, like proteins, oils, that unique fiber of chitin, and also look at fertilizers. So Sarah, Dr. Adcock, is an animal welfare expert. So she's really interested in feeding insect-based feeds to chickens, because there's some evidence that when chickens have a more natural and higher fiber diet, they engage in less aggressive behavior toward one another, and they're more satiated when they eat. So there's a lot of interesting kind of animal welfare questions that come with this. She's also really interested in the welfare of the insects themselves, which I'm fascinated by. And I'm personally really interested in egg quality. So what's the nutritional quality of those eggs after we've fed the hens? And then we're looking for collaborators in horticulture and agronomy to do some fertilizer-based trials with the frass from the insects. And then I'll just say on the waste streams, we're also interested in spent grains from breweries. There's obviously a lot of breweries in Wisconsin who don't have a good avenue for their spent grain. Spent coffee grounds is another thing in Madison that's not sometimes being composted, but mostly going in the trash. Spent mushroom substrate, cattle manure. They call this yellow grease, which is the post-cooking grease that restaurants have. So there's some thinking that black soldier flies would be good at dealing with that type of oil as well. And then I just wanted to bring this up because it just emerged in the last couple of weeks. There are several indigenous farms, and the Ho-Chunk Nation produces a lot of corn, indigenous corn, that has recently been contaminated by mycotoxins. So mycotoxins infect a lot of grain around the U.S., causing massive economic losses up to 25%. You've probably heard of aflatoxin. There's other mycotoxins that ruin grain. And low levels of mycotoxins are allowed in feed because they don't tend to damage animals if it's a very low level. And even lower levels are allowed in food grade products. But if you do consume mycotoxin infected foods, there are a lot of health risks, like really high levels can lead to acute poisoning, immune deficiency, and cancer can happen if you're exposed over long periods of time, and then stunting, which means low growth. So this is a real issue for developing countries in particular. But here in the US, it's still a real economic concern for farmers, because the only real recourse when you have an outbreak of mycotoxin is either to dilute what you sell, to mix contaminated grain with a big quantity of uncontaminated grain and dilute it, or you can kind of clean it mechanically, because broken kernels tend to be more susceptible to the fungus. But that's really expensive, and it doesn't always work. And so sometimes farmers have to just not get any money for that crop, grind it all up, and put it back on the field, because there's no other options for them. But one option might be actually feeding mycotoxin contaminated corn to black soldier flies. Insects actually are pretty good at eating things with mycotoxins. It doesn't accumulate in most insects. But there's interesting new data showing that even relatively high exposure in black soldier flies didn't affect their survival or their growth, and most of the mycotoxins do not bioaccumulate in the insect themselves. So something interesting is happening where the insects are altering these toxins by eating them and remediating this product. So the end result was safe levels of black soldier flies that could be fed with really not any mycotoxin in them. So it's this superhero ability to remediate this toxin. But we don't know the mechanism. We don't know what's happening with this biotransformation yet. It could be driven by the enzymes in the insect's gut or enzymes in microorganisms in the insect's gut and the microbiota, so we're not really sure. So we need more research on all of this. We also don't really know if the toxin is affecting the insect's welfare or well-being in any way. We don't know if it impact their fecundity or ability to reproduce long term. So we need longer term studies to understand if this would work. In our case, what we would like to do is partner with some of these indigenous growers to get samples of their contaminated corn and run it through our model and compare it to other remediation strategies and see if this is something that could actually help save money for folks that are losing value of their corn, especially when we see wetter growing seasons, because that's where you have higher risk of fungus growing on your ears of corn. And then there's a lot of other research opportunities. We're working with Dr. Andrea Hicks, Andrea, sorry, on a life cycle assessment in the Wisconsin context. So looking at, farm to gate, the full system of how we would farm black soldier fly. What are the greenhouse gas emissions? What is the water use? What are the outcomes of doing that in the Wisconsin context? So that means we have to consider keeping the insects warm in the wintertime, which is a challenge here compared to Florida, right? We want to design kind of low-tech options for Wisconsin farmers. So we are in touch with the world's leading expert of black soldier fly research, Dr. Jeff Tomberlin at Texas A&M. So this idea of a franchise model where you have one centralized insect farm that's actually rearing the insects through their full life cycle so that you have flies that are laying eggs. And then you have a whole bunch of farmers growing the larvae on their properties using their waste streams, and then bringing the larva back into a centralized processing facility. So that's actually what's happening in Uganda, which I'm going to tell you about in 1 second. Oops. So there's the animal welfare questions, the downstream health impacts, the organic question that I mentioned, the use of insect frass as fertilizer. And then we want to connect with other Wisconsin industries. Have you heard of Superior Fresh? They make, it's like aquaponics. They make really popular lettuces and microgreens and fish, and they're one of the biggest. They're the biggest in Wisconsin, I think. But they're interested in more sustainable fish feeds, so we could partner with them. And so we're looking for collaborators and interested students, so please let us know if you know of anyone. I just wanted to show you some pictures. This is our little farm on campus. We've run a few test models. Amira, I meant to mention. Amira was supposed to present with me today. She's our postdoc. She couldn't make it today, but I wanted her here because she's actually an insect farmer and she could tell you all about that. But she set this all up along with our tech consultant, Kevin Bachberg. And this is our adult rearing station. So it's very simple. This isn't super fancy stuff. We do have a ventilation system set up because you can have buildup of things like ammonia in these systems when they're inside. So we're trying to, that's another thing, to help farmers do this, you would want to figure out what's a feasible way to actually deal with ventilation that you would need. I'm going to skip that. And then just returning to Uganda, I wanted to let you know that when I was there, I was working with this farm that is doing black soldier fly farming with those refugees, in that refugee camp that I showed you, which is really exciting. Here's their outdoor adult flies. These are the prepupa and the larva, and they were actually sorting these by hand, larva from prepupa, which is a huge amount of work, and then we figured out that you can put them in water, and the prepupa float, and the larva sink, so you can separate them using water, which is pretty cool. But this is a circular economy in the real world, helping these refugees generate income and improve their food security. So this is a franchise model in the sense that there's a centralized hub, and then there's individual farmers who have one bin in their house who are giving their food scraps and everything to the black soldier flies, and then in 2 weeks they bring them back, and the farm buys them from the small farmer and gives them more eggs, and they start again. So I think dealing with the flies is a little bit complicated, but if you can get people engaged in farming without the flies, that can be great. And then I just want to end with our vision for UW-Madison in this work. We want to be leaders and innovators in the space of insect agriculture. We would be, I think, maybe the second US campus to have a black soldier fly colony set up to actually test a model with our own food waste. And I think we want to explore the realistic potential to address sustainability challenges at UW and around the world using black soldier flies and insects as feed. So thank you.
Well, that was really great. Thank you so much, Valerie.
Sure.
We have some time if there are some questions.
I would love to hear more about the insect welfare question. You mentioned it was a research point, but
Yeah.
really say.
Yeah, absolutely. So the sentience of insects is a bit debated because there are examples of, for example, a grasshopper is eating food and someone walks by and steps on its hind leg and the leg gets ripped off and the grasshopper just keeps eating. So there's a question of, is the grasshopper feeling pain? Is the grasshopper aware that it lost its leg? How sentient is an insect, right? So there are people on both sides of that debate that would argue that we should treat them just like any other animal, but clearly we don't, because we don't regulate in the university. You have to have like ethics approvals to work with animals, but you don't for insects.
No,
You
but
do
we
for
treat other animals well anyway.
No, I'm not saying that we do. I'm not arguing that, but we at least have some regulations around how to do it, and we don't.
There's no regulation at all.
No, you don't have to. I had a colony. We did a bunch of studies. We didn't have to get any approvals. Yeah, what you do for mice, right? So the question is, with insect farming, I think we should treat them as we would treat any living creature, and we should do everything in our power to make a natural living environment for them, and also at the harvest stage, make it as quick and, in our mind, painless as possible. My colleague, Dr. Adcock, who's the animal welfare expert, she wants to use sensors in the bins, like put sensors in the bins and take video and try and understand the natural behavior of the insects in different scenarios so that we can best design the farms with welfare in mind, which usually means productivity is higher too, because we know this from other animal agriculture, that when you take care of the animals, everything tends to go better, right? So we don't really know what their welfare needs are, and there hasn't been hardly any research on that at all. Honestly, entomological research in the past has really been good at killing insects.
Right.
Because we need to kill them in agricultural settings as pests, right? Or as vectors of disease. So we do not have good research on how to take care of insects. It's a great question. Yeah. And I wish Dr. Adcock could come. I invited her too, because she is, fascinating. She also pointed this out to me. She's like, one of the reasons that we don't connect with insects at all is because their faces don't move. So dogs are really expressive, right? Like they move their eyebrows, they smile at you. It's similar to what we do. So that's why we connect with them more than we even do a cow. And cats actually don't raise their eyebrows. So people sometimes think cats don't bond with us as much because they're just not as expressive in their faces. But obviously insects and fish, they don't express and they don't move. So it's easy to think they're not feeling anything. But we don't know.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
I'm interested in the breakdown of polystyrene.
Yeah.
You said that, which was the insect that did that?
Yeah, so there's a little bit of research on a few beetle species, including the yellow mealworm and a couple others, that we've shown they can survive on and break down polystyrene.
Then my next question is, do they break them down to microplastics that then get into
Yeah, exactly.
their
Yeah,
systems and anything that eats them?
Right, that's exactly, I think, the next follow-up question. So there's a group at Stanford that's been doing research on that, and so they have some preliminary data. And yeah, the next question is, what is it actually broken down into? Where does it go? What does it look like, and what's the safety of that? It's very preliminary research, but it was still kind of shocking that they could even break it down, because it almost hardly degrades, right? So, yeah, I wish I knew more. I think there's probably been some developments in the last few months that I haven't seen yet.
But there's been a lot of stuff recently in the amount of microplastic that enters the human body through consumption.
Absolutely. It's a little scary.
Regular food.
Right, and how dependent we are on plastic for everything.
Yes.
Like try and live without plastic for a few days. It's very hard. Good question. Yes.
Has there been any research on, I assume these can be, can live in different conditions, not too cold, probably not too hot,
Yep.
maybe a range of humidity conditions, but does their microbiota that potentially contributes to how they're able to process waste change depending on what conditions they live in?
Oh, that's a really good question. I don't know if anyone has looked at that specifically, but I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, there's certainly folks really looking at ranges of acceptable living conditions for the insects, and we know that like hotter means smaller. Like the growth of the insect is impaired if it gets above a certain temperature. I would guess that more than temperature, the feed substrate is going to affect the diversity and abundance of microbiota, just like it does with us. But that is a really good question. I'm going to go look that up because I don't know. It's a great question. Yeah, I really want to get a microbiologist on this project. We have a veterinarian who's kind of got a toxicology and biochemistry background, but we need like a microbiome expert to help us. Yeah. Also for the mycotoxins question, it's just like, how is that happening? How do we, yeah. Yes?
So for one of those bins that are growing the flies, what sort of tonnage are we talking about? How quickly do they breed, or how many?
Yeah.
How many does it take to make a can of protein?
Oh gosh, yeah, that's a great question. I actually thought about putting up a little diagram. I wish Amira was here because she would be able to tell you that off the top of her head. I know that when we do, small bins, we can put like 400 to 1,000 like mini larvae in there, and then they get bigger and bigger and bigger, and you can get several kilograms out of a bin. And that's the thing in Uganda with these guys taking like a little container home and doing it, and then they're selling back like 1 to 2 kilograms of insect protein, and they're being paid like $1, which is a huge amount of money, in that context. So it's very efficient, I can tell you that. And if you give me your name, I will get the numbers for you. If Amira was here, she would know. She does it all the time. Yeah, good question.
Are there any questions online? Okay. Any maybe final questions for Valerie? Well, thank you very much.
Yes.
It was very informative and very nice presentation. So thanks so much.